For those of you who are watching on Facebook, I think we are live now. Welcome. We are going to get started here in just another minute, but we're so thankful that you have joined us today. Again, if you have questions during this webinar on Facebook, you're watching on Facebook, go ahead and leave those in the comments below, and we will answer them either at the end or possibly even during if we are able to. So again, thank you for being here. We'll start in just a minute with the official webinar, but glad that you are here. All right, I think we are about to get started here. Hello and welcome to Adventist Risk Management's webinar, 4 Steps to Reopening Churches. My name is Chris LeBrun, and I am the manager for marketing and communication here at ARM. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. This topic has generated a lot of interest, and not just with our Adventist churches. You have probably seen this topic covered much on the news recently. And so again, a very important topic for this time as we look at how to safely reopen our churches and begin worshiping together in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Elder Ken Denslow and the North American Division for partnering with ARM to communicate and promote this webinar to the different conferences and unions. And there's a good chance that you are probably here watching today because of their work. And so we're grateful for that, and I want to thank them for that. I want to introduce our presenter for this afternoon. David Fournier is the Vice President and Chief Client Care Officer here at ARM. David, hello, welcome.
Thank you.
We are going to turn the time over to you in just a couple of minutes, but I want to do some announcements first. I know by now probably all of us are very used to being on Zoom, and we've probably had more Zoom calls than we would care to admit to. But if this is your first webinar with Zoom, want to go over a couple of things that you can do to make this experience good. We have a Q&A button down in the bottom of your Zoom app. You can use that to ask questions during the webinar. We will try to answer those in real time if possible. If not, David will be taking questions at the end, and so we may save some of those for the end. Again, don't use the chat feature in Zoom. Use the Q&A feature. Again, this is especially for webinars, so it might be new to you, but that will help us manage all those questions for you. We are broadcasting live or streaming live to Facebook today. And so if somebody that you know did not make it to register for this webinar, they can go watch there, and that is facebook.com/AdventistRisk. We will be making a video of this available on our website. It says June 1st here, I think, but we'll be doing it later this evening. We'll make that available on our website at adventistrisk.org. I will be back later with all of the great questions that people have been asking. But now I just want to say thank you again, and I'm going to turn the time over to you, David. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate your support, and I really have learned to count on the team as we put these together. I want to thank Chris LeBrun for his work making this possible, as well as Karina Franca, another team member who's helping us here behind the scenes to make this possible. And I want to add my thanks as well to the administration of the North American Division, who has worked with us, partnered with us to make this information available and promote this webinar for more people to be able to learn more about reopening and the reopening process. I wanted to speak, and I'm going to stay on our announcements page before we move into the first slides. I have a few opening comments that I wanted to make. Don't be distressed if I'm not moving the slide forward quite yet. But I want us to talk a little bit about sort of some foundational things about what we're about to talk about. And obviously, we're having this webinar in the context of reopening our churches after COVID-19. So I want to make sure that everybody on the call sort of has a baseline understanding of what we're talking about. I don't like to assume that somebody understands something or is coming at this without the same knowledge. So we're talking about COVID-19, the current pandemic situation. I would say this is fairly unprecedented with the amount of restriction and lockdown that has been taking place around the world. I know I've not experienced anything like this in my lifetime, and I would say that most have not. So we're talking about COVID-19. A few items on how COVID-19 spreads, and these are important for us to understand as we look at ways to mitigate and how we will continue to take steps to ensure we are reopening safely. So understanding what it is and how it spreads is important. Keeping in mind, of course, that science and the experts are learning about this illness, new things every day. Ongoing research is taking place, and it seems as though we do learn new elements fairly regularly. So how COVID-19 spreads, it's spread between people who are in close contact with one another. Sort of the benchmark that I've been aware of, I've heard people use the most, is within about 6 feet. For some of our friends to the north or in other parts of the world, I think I've heard most frequently 2 meters often used. Through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or talks. So much like a cold or the flu. These droplets can land in the mouths or noses of people who are nearby, or possibly be inhaled into the lungs, much like the cold or flu. Some people without symptoms may be able to spread the virus as well. The best way to prevent illness is to avoid being exposed to the virus. Symptoms of COVID-19, I want to add these as well. Symptoms can include cough, shortness of breath, fever, chills, muscle pain, sore throat, loss of taste or smell, and in severe cases, pneumonia. So that's just sort of a baseline for us to understand as we get started. And I hope that you will go with us on this journey as we look at what we can do in the reopening process and understand that several things. Number one, for all of the folks on the webinar this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you may be, you are under many different jurisdictions. You may be in the United States or Canada or any number of other countries. And each of those jurisdictions may have different guidelines in place. And from what I've observed, and I've tried to read through information from Canada, the health agencies in Canada, in the United Kingdom, there's the NIH, Here in the United States, it's the CDC. We're also aware of guidance from the World Health Organization. You're going to need to be paying attention to the guidance in your area. And sometimes it gets even more granular than the country that you're in. It can be as granular as, in my case, I'm located in Maryland in the United States right now. And in the state of Maryland, the governor has eased some of the restrictions related to COVID-19 at this time. However, what he's done is he's also left a lot of the discretion for those restrictions to the county level. Here in Maryland, it's not a very large state, but we have some counties that have very low incidence of COVID-19, maybe lower populations in general. People are more spread apart, and it just hasn't been a lot of incidents there. And then there are other counties, unfortunately, like the one I live in, that have had very high incidence of COVID-19. So the restrictions in my county where I live are very high, and some of the other counties are a little bit more eased. That may be the case where you live. And again, I would encourage you to pay attention to the guidance you're receiving where you are located. That's going to be important. Another important thing for us to remember is this is such a developing situation. We are seeing new information released as experts do their research. We see guidance change and standards are developed. I look forward to the day when we understand everything there is to know about this. Unfortunately, that day has not arrived yet. So I think with all of that said, we're going to dive into the webinar about reopening churches. And I hope that you will prioritize with me. We are the church. I saw somebody posted a clever saying on Facebook recently saying that the church is not a building. And I couldn't agree with that more. The church is us. It's you and me. It's meeting however it is that we meet. It's serving as the hands and feet of Christ, however we're able to serve in wherever we're able to serve. I think it's important for us to prioritize the well-being of our faith community, whether it's our local church, our small Sabbath school group, our friends and family, as well as those that we are seeking to reach with the good news of Jesus. That means being sensitive to the needs in our community as well. Those are important priorities for us. I look at the example of Christ in the Gospels. I've been fortunate to be reading through the Gospels recently, and I look at every action that Christ takes is in the interest of the well-being of the people that he's meeting with. His work here was absolutely incredible. His love for his people, and his people are all people, is absolutely profound. I think we should be looking at this and every circumstance and everything that we decide to do through that lens of caring for people's well-being, as well as sharing his love, the good news of the gospel as well. So let's get into some of the details of reopening. My first request of you is that you follow local laws. I've highlighted a bit of this already, but it's going to be important for you to look at your local government restrictions and understand what specific restrictions they may have. I don't know if you remember, as we got into this a few months ago, I remember hearing one of the first states that was dealing with incidents of COVID-19, and I remember that they announced there is no more than 500 people allowed to congregate in one place. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. That's going to be fascinating. What about conventions and all kinds of things that are taking place? 500 people. And that quickly turned into 150 people, 50 people, and really kind of ended up, for the most part, in most places I'm aware of, at about 10. And it seems to have been at 10 for quite some time now. I would expect that same process to probably work in reverse as well. I would look for that kind of guidance from your local government as far as what type of restrictions they're allowing the number of people to gather at any one time. So look for that kind of information. The number of attendees. Are masks still required? Masks, we use the term masks. I mean face coverings. I think most of the face coverings people are using really don't qualify as a mask per se, but you understand the terminology. We're talking about face coverings. You're also thinking about what are the requirements around distance. And so we're going to look at some of this in a lot more detail, but I want you to be able to look at the information from your area specifically, and what are some key things that you can look for in that information as it becomes available. And it will become available at different times, in different ways, depending on where you are. The restrictions in some places are quite a bit different than they are in others. The experience of let's say the state of New York right now, and the city of New York is quite a bit different, let's say, than West Virginia, for example, for perhaps obvious reasons due to social density and whatnot, and who knows what other factors as well. So I'm not going to guess about that, but I do know that there are big differences depending on where you are. So we're going to talk today about 4 steps for reopening. The first step is going to be the cleaning process. Step 2, we're going to get into mitigating risk. Step 3, we're going to talk about communication. And step 4 is to reassess procedures. This is based on general risk management practices. So you make a plan. It's always important to revisit to see what's working and make sure that you are making the right processes and choices, and that they're still working effectively. So let's get into the first step, cleaning. And the key here is to develop a cleaning plan. And this is a multi-phase cleaning plan. It really needs to address a plan for a deep clean of your facility before reopening. So some of your facilities may have seen very little use, or even very few visits by any person whatsoever. Some of these facilities may have been checked on. I hope they've been checked on while you've been under a stay-at-home phase. So your building may have been empty. The water may not have been running while you're staying at home. If you're still in a stay-at-home phase, let me just add, please do check on your facility from time to time. Have someone who can take responsibility for the maintenance and upkeep of that facility to check on it. Make sure that there's not vandalism, it hasn't been broken into, that you aren't experiencing frozen water pipes, that kind of thing. Hopefully no one's experiencing frozen water pipes at this time of year, but it's been a strange year, so who knows. But you'll want to engage in a deep clean plan before the initial reopening. Part of that I'm particularly concerned about is making sure that you are having perhaps a professional come out and take a look at your heating and air conditioning systems, your HVAC systems. It's a good time to do a deep clean of those, replacing the filters and ensuring that all of that is working effectively. It's widely promoted to air out your building as much as possible. This will be something you're going to want to do in an ongoing way, not just in preparation for reopening, but also during the week, whenever possible, and while services are going on. Fresh air, as we've known for years, is incredibly important and is helpful in minimizing the potential impact of COVID-19, apparently. So why not capitalize on that? Then you're going to want to be able to do a deep clean also between any use of the facility. So if you are meeting more than once, if you're having a midweek meeting, you'll want to make sure that there is an effective cleaning process taking place between each of those meetings. That would include, for example, if you choose, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, if you're choosing to split your service into more than one service in order to have fewer people together at one time and be more distant from each other, that 6 feet, 2-meter rule. It's easier to do that with fewer people in the building. Again, would encourage a cleaning process taking place between those different groups of people using the space. And that gets us really to the while services are going on, there should be also cleaning taking place while services are going on. If at all possible, you're going to want to have your any door handles or doors in general sort of propped open, or if you have automatic doors, so much the better. But if you don't, then cleaning of the doors between use. Restroom facilities are a particularly sensitive scenario, and they should be cleaned repeatedly pretty much after every use while maybe services are going on. It's important to go the extra mile for that. Just the nature of those facilities and how plumbing works, it can actually spread infection fairly easily in that scenario. So important to keep things wiped down, sterilized on an ongoing basis. So let's take a look around our church right now. You're going to want to look at your pews and the furniture on the platform, on the rostrum, and make sure that all of that furniture, every pew has been sterilized and wiped down effectively. Obviously, that's going to be easier to do and more effective to do with harder surfaces like a plastic seat or a wooden seat, that kind of thing. When it comes to fabrics, I encourage you to do your very best. Sometimes those have a tendency to retain some items that could include the virus in this case. Bathrooms. The mother's room. We've talked about bathrooms already. Mother's rooms require the same kind of approach of not only a pre-cleaning ahead of time or between services, but an ongoing cleaning if it is being used. Any high-touch areas need special attention. And we're talking about wiping down surfaces with disinfectant cleaners. If you're wondering where to find out more about disinfectant cleaners and where to get them, what kind of standards to meet, there is a fantastic resource. Maybe some of our team members can post links. Sorry to surprise you guys, but I know you have the links on that information. I know the CDC has an effective link, web page about the different products that could be used, or even how to make those products, what they contain, if they're not readily available to you in your area. AV equipment is of particular concern. I think, especially if there is going to be any sharing of microphones, I would look for any opportunity to avoid sharing of microphones, but making sure that each of those pieces of equipment that somebody might handle or touch have been sterilized or sanitized ahead of time. Disinfected. There's the word I'm looking for. This is the third time we do this webinar, so I knew I'd start tripping up some sort of verbiage. Tables and chairs, teaching aids in Sabbath school rooms. I know the North American Division is working on some additional support resources for children's ministries. I had a chance to review some of that information just today. And so there's some good information coming specifically for that area of ministry. I would add some caution that, especially for the younger groups of children, some of the realities that we're up against in keeping that area clean and keeping those young people at a sufficient distance and not interacting with items that get passed around could be so challenging as to be impractical. So I encourage you to consider how you go about that process. You may actually find it better to start opening with a small group of divine service, and then delay the opening of some of those kinds of activities like Sabbath schools, whether adult or the young people. As we think about cleaning teaching aids, I remember being in kindergarten, believe it or not, and there are those hard sticks that we'd beat together and we'd sing songs. That's fairly easy to clean and maybe is of some use if they've been, disinfected and only handed to one person. That's assuming that the person doing the handing is completely clean as well. You see the logistical challenge there. But compare that, which is, okay, maybe we can get that disinfected with, say, some of the plush toys. Those would need to have been effectively laundered entirely and may still be very difficult to call clean. So you're going to need to limit access to any of those kinds of things that people might be tempted to pick up and use, pass around, and everything that could possibly be used must be disinfected. I've already talked about air conditioning units and filters, something for sure to take care of ahead of time. I would add to that, there should be some concern about water systems. If your building has been closed for some time, your water may have been stagnant or sitting still in your systems, whether in the pipes or various systems throughout your facility. You may have an ice maker. You may, with ice that's just been sitting there for several months. You may have a water cooler, a water fountain. Again, potential for ice or water just sitting there. I don't know what the potential impact from a COVID-19 is, but I am aware of other bacteria and diseases that should be of concern when those systems have been sitting and the water has been just standing or stagnant. Legionnaire's disease comes to mind. Not a doctor, but I understand that that's a concern that's been raised at least by the CDC as well as other agencies in other areas as well. So again, you would want to look for perhaps a thorough flushing of your systems, testing if at all possible for any of those kinds of contaminants, and working with a professional to ensure that that's been done correctly at your facility. All right, let's look at step 2, mitigation, and doing a critical review. Here's where we would encourage you to think through, and I hope that we have lots and lots of pastors on our webinar today. But no matter what type of church leader you are, I encourage you to think of yourself as a leader, and look for ways to be proactively solution-oriented when it comes to the ministry that you're trying to achieve, the missional goal of your congregation, your local group, as well as thinking through how you can do that effectively. So as you analyze what you would normally be doing, think about social gatherings, potlucks, perhaps you have choir, musical groups, study groups, those kinds of things. Think through the nature of each of those types of meetings or activities and analyze how that would work in this current scenario. I would say that social gatherings, potlucks, would be very difficult to manage and to do well, because they are by nature meant to bring people close together, and there should be a good potluck involves the sharing of food, which really limits any effectiveness of any other efforts you may be trying to achieve, such as physical distance or disinfecting anything. You really have made that to no effect. Choir and praise team practice, maybe you're going to find a great creative way to achieve that. But please keep in mind, you're going to need to keep people fairly far apart from each other. Do you have the space for that? What are they going to come in contact with? There's at least anecdotal evidence that singing in general produces a certain amount more force than is normal in speaking. Some of us, project a little bit as we're speaking anyway, but choirs, singing groups, praise teams, and even the congregation in song really raises the potential for those droplets to be projected quite a bit further than just in normal conversation. This is apparently the case, and we look for more evidence about this, more scientific evidence, that even with some face coverings, there are varying degrees of protection when engaged in song. So we love singing, we love music. It's uplifting, it's inspiring, and it brings us together. But maybe we need to explore ways to do that a bit differently, or reserve that part of our worship experience for when we are in our family groups or meeting for some parts of our service online. I still think perhaps especially Sabbath school and small group type activities, in my own experience, have worked out very well online for those who can participate in that. And it may be best to start small in our reopening with a small divine service. Something to think about. You'll notice on the bulleted list here, the next one is passing the offering plate. Obviously, passing the offering plate is a poor choice under the current circumstances, but obviously we need some options. From what I understand, and I've been paying attention to reports from church leaders in the treasury field as well on this, there is potentially a significant downturn in giving at this time, at least in some places. Giving is part of worship, and it's important for us to continue to do. I understand some of the downturn in giving may actually be due to people with either reduced or income or losing their job. So we understand that for sure. But when it comes to those of us who are employed and can give, I think it's important to be able to facilitate that in a way that makes sense. And the church already has a great solution in place. Here in North America, there is an online giving service system that many churches already participate in. If your church is not participating in that yet, now is a really good time to look into making that available at your local church. You can work with your conference to put that in place for your local church. I heard a creative idea on, some people may not be able to use the online process or system. So I learned about an alternative method that helps to mitigate the passing of an offering plate. And that would be to have a centralized bucket, essentially. I'm reminded of the story of, I believe it was Joash in the Bible, where they created a chest and they put the monies in there in order to restore and rebuild the temple. And so a similar idea, having a bucket, I would hope, guarded by a burly deacon, where people are able to, in a touchless way, deposit, drop their tithe envelopes, offerings, those kinds of things into the thing without touching a person or an offering plate. So that is an idea that I've heard, I think is a reasonable alternative for passing an offering plate around a church at this time, at least in this initial phase. We've talked a little bit about teaching aids in Sabbath school classes already. I think it's especially for those younger groups, that's a very difficult reality. That is what makes those Sabbath school classes work really well, is the incredibly engaging materials and activities that they engage in there. But really, those are the risk. That's where the risk is for those groups. So we would look at either not doing that, having those classes in person in an initial stage, or finding very limited ways of engaging in that, in those classes. And again, the North American Division is releasing some really good information on how to go about that, and what to do and what you're up against on that as well. So that information should be coming soon. New policies. So again, we're still in step 2. Items before the service require face coverings for everyone in attendance. We're going to talk about how this is communicated next, but take temperatures at the door. I did not know this before the COVID-19 pandemic. However, there are devices that can, in a touchless manner, take your temperature. And they're unfortunately not inexpensive, but I think well worth the cost from what I've seen of the examples in the marketplace so far, in order to do a touchless temperature check for those attending. Because again, you don't want anyone attending that is showing symptoms of COVID-19. And we talked about those earlier. So taking temperatures at the door. You see here, install automatic doors. Again, looking for solutions that create a touchless environment. Perhaps for your local church, purchasing and installing touchless doors may not be a practical or affordable solution for you. I understand. But for those where that may be possible, I encourage you to think about it. Look for ways for perhaps in your bathrooms, if you can simply wave your hands underneath the faucet and it produces water. That is a better approach than having to touch the knobs. If those kinds of adjustments are possible for you, if you don't have those already, then I encourage you to think about and see if those would be possible at this time. Encouraging that touchless environment as much as possible. During the service, of course, we're discouraging handshakes, hugs, and other member contact. In fact, we're trying to keep people at least 6 feet or 2 meters apart from each other, or at least family groups. Obviously, if I go to church with my wife and daughter, the 3 of us live together. We live in close proximity together. We're going to sit very close together. But we'll try to keep ourselves at least 6 feet or 2 meters apart from anyone else that we see there at the service. 2 church services with a break in between for cleaning. And we're just assuming 2 churches, 2 church services. You may actually find the need to have more than 2. I suspect somebody's going to need a break in there. But the important part there is to really reduce the number of people who are meeting together, provide an opportunity for cleaning. Keeping the group so that they're only ever interacting, even in a limited way, with the same people is another way to limit the possibility for any spread of the disease, the illness. So that's the idea there. Blocking off sections inside the sanctuary for social distancing. Again, this would be the idea of, I think of this in light of how communion has been run traditionally. At least in the churches I've attended, there tends to be an every other pew approach, and that may be an effective methodology to use now as well. We're going to block off every other pew, and then we're going to try to space and stagger people out so that they can remain 6 feet apart or 2 meters apart as well. After the service, dismiss the audience 1 row at a time. Again, just a methodology for keeping people separated rather than all moving to the exits at the same time and crowding through the doorways. You're looking for a staggered, measured approach where people are able to maintain that distance in a regulated kind of way. I always think about the pastor at this part as well. We have a tradition, as far as I know, and perhaps for hundreds of years at this point, of when a minister is finished speaking, they go down the aisle. It's a quite an exit. There's great music and everything, and they tend to stay at the door and greet the congregation as they exit. That's not a practical solution right now, but that's a reflex we have That's what we're used to doing. When I see my pastor, I'm going to stick my hand out to try to shake his hand no matter how hard I try. So it's going to be hard work on both of our part, his or her part and mine, to say, no, I'm going to maintain the physical distance. I can, affirm, appreciate, greet my fellow congregants and minister without engaging in physical contact. So you may have to think that through ahead of time. When a minister is planning their service, they may have to even, and we'll get into communication next, think through, I'm going to, we're going to pray, I'm going to walk out the door, and I'm going to keep walking, and I'm going to get in my car, and I'm going to leave. Unless, of course, you have to lock up or something like that. But you need to find a way to make sure that those reflexes don't take over, and we don't start interacting in ways that really defeat the purpose here. So let's look at communication just a little bit here. Before the return to church, you want to prepare your members as much as possible. And I think this is important for all ministry leaders, whether you are leading in a children's division or you're the minister, whatever it is that you're doing, work to prepare the entire congregation for the changes that will be taking place. Explain the steps and the why. Because people are not used to coming to church and having their temperature taken. They're not used to coming to church and being asked to wear a mask or a face covering. They're not used to coming to church and not shaking the minister's hand. So I think it's also really important for us to grapple with the fact that there is a wide range of knowledge and opinion about this subject. Our world has gotten more and more contentious, it seems, over the years. Maybe it's always been that way on some level, but there is a lot of different opinion about these things, and including on this particular issue of COVID-19 and how to relate to it. I think it's important to be understanding of the length and breadth of perspective, and understand that other good people may have a very different idea about this than you do. So that's why it's important to understand and be able to communicate the steps that this church is taking in its approach to this situation. This is the way we expect people to behave and interact at our church. Not everyone will understand. I know that. Not everyone will want to cooperate, but I think it's important to be proactive and clear in what the expectations are. And I think it's appropriate as well to ask those who potentially belong to a vulnerable community. There are different groups that have been identified as being particularly susceptible to COVID-19. I think there's a lot more research to be done on that. I encourage you to look into that further. Certainly the one that has probably been most frequently discussed is that the elderly are particularly vulnerable. There are people with other types of conditions, however, such as compromised immune systems. Too long of a word there, but folks with a compromised immune system, it may not be in their best interest to be part of the first reopening and coming back to church. And I know, especially with the elderly, they may be the ones who are most excited to return to what they've experienced and treasured their whole lives. But I ask you to work with people in a loving, Christ-like way to at least give them the opportunity to understand that that may not be the best choice at this point for them. But again, we're not going to play the role of the police in this. We may have to partner with the police if there are extreme circumstances, but I would encourage you to be kind and Christ-like in how it's communicated, that it's communicated clearly, and that you're able to have a strong plan that everyone needs to buy into. So I think that's important. Creating signs and floor stickers can be very helpful. I'm sure that most, if not all of you, have at least visited perhaps a grocery store during this whole scenario. I've been to a grocery store. I was very interested in some of the adjustments that they made. There's typically some stickers, lines on the floor that help me understand what 6 feet is as I'm walking in the aisles, and particularly at the checkout area. This can be helpful in our church facility as well. That could be perhaps in the aisle as well as in the pew area, to make sure that people understand and can kind of see what's that distancing looks like. I think signage is also appropriate before you get into the building. Not everyone who may want to attend your facility, your worship service, may be able to hear your pre-communication efforts. If you were trying to communicate how this is all going to work ahead of time via email and a webinar, what if somebody who's not a member of your congregation is looking to attend there with you? They may not have had any opportunity to see any of that. So some signage can be very appropriate. That will give them an opportunity to understand what's happening at this facility and how this worship is being conducted. That the expectation is that you won't have any symptoms of COVID-19 when you go to worship there, that you will wear a mask, a face covering, that you will maintain some distance between you and other people. You can also use bulletin announcements and on-screen messages. I use the term bulletin. I'm actually trying not to promote the idea of printed and distributed paper bulletins. I think bulletins could move more effectively to our digital sphere for right now, especially email. You may have a better email list now than ever before for distributing information about your local church. You may have screens around your facility, both in the sanctuary and in the lobby area, that are able to display the order of service, information that's important for anybody attending to know. Of course, you can always use the announcement segment of the service. I don't think this is a pick one thing. I think this is a use all of these tools at including announcements and signage. And then practices, especially of the pastor, need to align with messaging. Again, I hope there's quite a number of you on this webinar today. I want to speak to you as a leader, and I know that sometimes leaders sometimes wonder if people are following, and sometimes it can be a struggle to think that your actions and your what you communicate is listened to and appreciated as much as you wish it was. But I can assure you that you are watched, you are listened to, and you are appreciated. And the actions that you take set a tone. It's in the risk management industry. This is one of the most critical things for success or failure of risk management in any organization, and that is tone at the top. If you treat these measures as something that applies only to other people, if you treat these as something that is silly but someone takes seriously, but not you, I can assure you almost no one in your congregation, in your church family, will take that seriously at all. It's important for the pastor to lead by example. Show people that you are taking it seriously, that you are caring for their well-being, in many cases by maintaining distance, by taking the wearing of a face covering seriously. That gets to a question that we usually get. Maybe somebody's already asked it today, and that is, should a pastor be wearing a face covering while preaching? And it's a great question, and I think it needs to be contextualized. I think we need to look at that, the answer to that question, in the light of each individual worship facility experience. In some cases, I think the minister may be speaking at sufficient distance away from the congregation where a mask may not be necessary. They may be able to be wearing a microphone that only they use. I know that's the case for many ministers. I have the opportunity to attend many churches as I travel around in the line of work that I'm in. And I've noticed that that is often the case, certainly not always the case. In some other congregations, other worship facilities, the minister may actually be fairly close to the congregation. If that is the case, I think a microphone and a face covering may be appropriate. If they can have the distance and to use a microphone that only they use, perhaps it would be appropriate to take the face covering off for that part of the service. Difficult. I certainly rely heavily on being able to see someone, see their face in order to fully capture expression. And for some reason, I think I understand what I'm hearing better when the mouth movements match. But I think it's an appropriate measure in some cases if you just don't have the distance that you can maintain from the congregation. But you're going to have to work that through given the specific logistics of your location. Step 4, reassess procedures. Discuss with the safety committee how effective your new policies are. For some of you, you may be seeing that term safety committee and saying, wait, what? Safety committee? I don't have one of those. I hope that most, if not all of you, do have a safety committee. I hope that you have a safety officer who's a member of your board, and I hope that you have a safety committee that works on key safety initiatives in your church. If not, Adventist Risk Management on our website has free resources, including job description and all of the information you need to know on how to engage in the safety processes of your church and your ministry functions. So I encourage you to make use of that, especially now. It would be very appropriate during this situation to have a safety committee in place, making sure that all of the right processes are taking place and thinking through all of the different ministry implications in the different types of activities that you may want to get back into, how to get back into them, in what order, and ensure that the right processes are taking place. You may find as that committee meets and analyzes and reviews what is taking place, that revisions may be necessary, and those will need to be communicated back out to the membership. This committee can also help digest all of that guidance that we're getting from our state or provincial or county guidance, our different governments, I should say. I think it's appropriate to monitor the health of your membership as much as possible. You want to be aware of their health and be able to minister to them anyway, but particularly at this time, it would be very appropriate to know if somebody is experiencing COVID-19 and if they have been in contact with any other members. At this time, someone is probably asking the question about contact tracing. I've been looking for information where a government authority has said that a church is required, or an organization that would include churches would be required to engage in any processes to facilitate contact tracing. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, it's the idea of being able to understand and sort of track or trace anyone who has COVID-19, who they came in contact with. So did they go to the gas station? Did they go to the grocery store? Did they go to a funeral? Did they meet with some family members? Who was there? obviously, it makes sense to think that through in the church environment. I have not found very clear guidance in any direction saying that it was a required function of a church to provide or track that information yet. That's not to say that that isn't the case somewhere. This is a big world and there's a lot of guidance out there right now. So please be aware of what guidance may be in place in your area. I would be hesitant to pursue any contact tracing, recording of any information, whether that's attendance and all of that kind of thing, recording people's personal information for those purposes, unless there was guidance specifically from your government authority. It seems like a good idea for tracking the virus down. However, you are now responsible for protecting people's private personal information. There's quite a conundrum there. So I would look for that kind of guidance from your local government authority to make sure that you are within their expectations and are facilitating it in a way that meets the need without simply compromising people's personal information for no expectation from the government. So please continue to track that one with us. I expect that to develop further as we go forward, have no doubt. So temporarily return to virtual church if members are getting sick. You may discover that some of these processes are simply not working and you are getting either congregants are becoming ill, or some of what it takes to make this happen is so either onerous, difficult, or just compromised that either it's not working or you need to take a few steps back before you move forward effectively again. I think it's appropriate and a sign of good leadership when someone is able to say and decide to take a step back in order to take a better step forward with a better plan. So don't be afraid to be that leader and make that kind of a decision. As we conclude, I ask you to prioritize people's well-being at this time. Protecting members and visitors is sort of intrinsic. I think it is absolutely part of the ministry and the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and all Christians committed to spreading the gospel. Serving our membership in this way is absolutely at the heart of ministry. So with that, I think, Chris, are you back in action out there somewhere?
Yes, I am here. We have been answering questions throughout this process, and have some more for you.
Okay.
Well, the first question that people certainly are interested in is the liability issue,
Okay.
and how ARM plays a part in that. What is covered through our insurance policies, and is there any risk for churches to be sued for negligence in any situation related from people attending or getting sick while they're at our congregations and at our churches?
Okay. All right. So thank you for leading with probably the hardest question we could possibly get.
Get the tough one out of the way first.
Thank you, Chris. No, it's a good question, and it's certainly one that we've been working on and dialoguing together and have answered before. That said, I think also, Chris, if I'm not mistaken, you're working on a frequently asked questions resource, and there are already answers to that and some similar questions on our website at adventistrisk.org/COVID-19. I probably said that too fast, so if somebody would drop that into the chat or something, that'd be helpful. But that page does have some answers to that question. Let me take a quick approach to it. I should not have said quick. I'm not sure there's a quick way to go about this one. But I think there's two parts to the question. And when we talk about liability of somebody getting COVID-19 due to negligence at your church, there are several realities that we have to understand in that context. Number one, this is fairly unprecedented. There is not a lot of case law that anybody's able to reference. So how this will play out in courts largely remains to be seen. Insurance policies also rely on experience. How was the insurance policy interpreted in an actual scenario? That helps insurance companies articulate the intent of their policy more effectively in the future, whether it's providing more clear coverage, removing coverage, or yes, this, not that kind of thing. In this case, I want to distinguish between two ideas. If your church facility chooses to reopen in defiance of, you know, the local authorities in your area, and if there are any fines or penalties associated with that, those are not covered by insurance. Insurance in general, as a general principle, excludes paying for fines and penalties when you break the law. We encourage you to follow the law, especially when it is trying to keep people safe from harm or illness. Now, that said, many places are moving to reopening and are allowing churches to move through this process of reopening. If you are doing that in a diligent manner, and I would like to think that by attending this webinar, you are on a path of trying to do this in a diligent manner. Let's look at a what if scenario. Somebody comes to your congregation, worships with you, and they result in having a case of COVID-19. They are going to have to show that it was the church's negligence that caused them to become ill. To my knowledge, that is going to be very difficult for anyone to do. How can they prove that it was attendance at that meeting, at that worship service, that is the reason that they contracted the illness? Now, I'm not saying this to comfort us at all, but it is part of the reality of what we're looking at here. I think they have to show that your church was negligent, which means that you didn't do the reasonable things that a church has been directed to and should do. That's what we've been trying to talk about, are the reasonable things. Some of you probably think the things we've talked about may go beyond reasonable. And I think some of you may look at it and say, no, I've found even stricter guidelines over here or over here. You're absolutely right, and you should follow those because that is what's reasonable in that jurisdiction. So that's the scenario where that might take place. What I can say is we would define that as a bodily injury claim, where the person has become sick due to negligence, potential or alleged negligence at the very least, on the behalf of by our insured. There is no exclusion to my knowledge, and I have been looking really hard to see if there's any exclusion to a COVID-19 or pandemic for that reason. So there's no exclusion. So what I do know is if that scenario happened, Adventist Risk Management expects to provide a defense, mount a defense on our insured's behalf. How that plays out from there, again, completely uncharted waters. This is my first rodeo with a pandemic. So, and it is largely untested across most of the industry for the most part.
Yeah.
I hope that incredibly short answer is helpful. But again, we do have some of that information available on our website already, and Chris is working on a great Q&A document to support that, make that those questions answered even further.
Yeah, and we will give the website again for where all of our resources on COVID-19 are. One question that I have not heard as we have done this previously this week, and that is, what about when churches who are renting to Sunday congregations? How does that apply to both our liability, but also to the policies that we want to have in place to keep people safe on our property, and cleanings in between times? And how do we manage that relationship with those Sunday congregations?
Well, that is something that I certainly I actually have intentions to meet with our legal team to explore that question more fully. At the very least, what we're looking at in that scenario is heightened tensions between the two organizations, because you would be very concerned that the other organization, and this is probably true of your church as well as the other church, you'd be very concerned about what cleaning practices, what distancing practices, what other, whether it's wearing a mask or what have you, are taking place, because it starts to feel as though you have very little control and the stakes are high. So it's something that I'm looking to explore more fully. I expect to see more information about that coming into our FAQ process as well. I don't have a lot of definitive answers, but I think, I do hope that you have a use agreement in place with that other party in the first place. There may be some remedy found in that already, but again, we need to work through that from a careful legal standpoint. And at the end of the day, if you're the property owner, you may have some decisions to make. I encourage you, however you're navigating that, to do so in cooperation with your conference, and perhaps they will be bringing in legal counsel as well if you're navigating a difficult interaction with the other party, the Sunday keeping church. Yeah,
absolutely. Speaking of difficult interactions, some of the recommendations that were given today that the CDC has made and that we are passing along, temperature checks, face coverings, social distancing, all of those things. Some people are not keen to follow those guidelines.
sure.
How do we deal with people who do not want to comply with those rules, or just flat out refusing to do so? What can we use in those situations?
Right.
And an add-on to that, before you start answering, is there a waiver that people should sign if they are unwilling to follow some of those recommendations that help prevent some of the liability in those cases?
Yeah, I think we may see a move in a direction. I don't have one in place now, and it's not part of our current recommended practice yet. But I can see that as a potential development of the use of waivers simply to attend. And I don't just mean those people who don't want to wear the face covering, or don't want to have a temperature check. I would look for those people to not attend. And those should be the kind instructions given. Here at this facility, we have, you came onto the campus and probably were inundated with signage saying that you need to be doing these things, and you're here at the door saying you don't want to, but that is what we're doing here. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church has chosen to do that here. We're hoping that you will do that. I would say, however, that it is not appropriate, in my view, to become the authorities in that case. It's not time for several burly deacons to pick someone up and manhandle them. I think that's really an inappropriate response on most days. So I think it is important to partner with local law enforcement on any extreme cases. And please make sure that by the time you're making those choices, that it is an extreme case. Not everyone understands. So you want to treat them in a Christ-like manner. as a reasonable person would. As it turns out, Christ-like and meeting the letter of the law are often very closely aligned as far as what the expectation of someone behaving like a reasonable person is. So it sounds like, and it should sound like, I'm saying two things that are maybe in almost complete opposition to each other. Be very strong and clear that of what the expectation is of how people are to behave, what they're to do during your worship service in that property. That said, don't punch anyone and haul them out. I think that's worse. I hope we can all agree. It's important for us to de-escalate those kind of tensions, not escalate them.
Yeah, another question that came in, and again, this was a new one for us this week. Is there any guidance on what temperature we are supposed to be looking at as we're taking these temperature checks as a baseline? It seems to me, and I don't have the research right in front of me, it seems that I've heard 100 degrees temperature is Fahrenheit is the sort of that line. Have you heard anything different? Or we can certainly look that up and include that in the FAQ, but I don't, just want to see if you had any answers on that.
You know, I am the worst person to ask that question, and I don't have that at the very top of my mind. I absolutely did read some guidelines on that. It was less than 100, but only slightly more than an average temperature. And I believe it may vary slightly on age. And of course, if we were giving that information today, we would want to be sensitive to, different measurements. But I believe that information is fairly widely available in these documents, and we can be sure to include that in our FAQ information going forward. That would have been a wonderful thing for me to remember today, but I apologize, I missed that one.
Absolutely. And there were several people who noted that on the slide it mentioned hymnals and Bibles, but they seem to think that you skipped over that section. So just wanted to circle back to that and reinforce the idea with taking hymnals and Bibles out of the pews so that there's one less thing that people are touching and spreading those germs on.
Well, thank you for bringing it up, because absolutely right. I totally missed that. I skipped that for some reason, and we've got the best audience possible. This is fantastic. So, yes, the idea with that bullet that I completely skipped over is to just remove your hymnals, Bibles, anything that could be, and there's a principle behind this, right? Anything that could be shared, used again by another person, that is perhaps more difficult to fully disinfect. Just remove those. I think people are more and more used to using their own device. Maybe they can bring their own Bible. Maybe if you are able to do singing in your congregation, and again, that's a bit of a question and a judgment call on that. Maybe you can project the words on the screen and take that approach for the time being, or making use of some various apps that can facilitate that as well. But I would move those out of the space entirely.
Yeah. Another question is it possible for COVID-19 to be spread in a baptistry? Should baptisms be put on hold at this time? And how do we address that?
That's a great question. I was thinking about that one this week a few times, and I think it comes down to some personal choices by the individuals involved. The minister who's conducting the baptism and the person being baptized. Because there's obviously some close quarters contact that's going to take place. That's fairly unavoidable. There may also be some, interaction from a deacon or deaconess. Those need to be thought through as well. You try to operate in isolated groups, right? So I have been in contact with my wife, who happily lives here with me, my daughter, and two other individuals that I've had contact with. And I don't mean that I touched them, but I've been in the same place with them more than once. And that's it. When I'm out needing to get groceries, I really do go the extra mile to wear the coverings. I'll do even gloves. Um, I sanitize my vehicle. I sanitize my groceries. I try to do absolutely everything I possibly could, not even for my own sake, but for those people that I come in contact with. So I say all of that to say I think it's a decision between the person being baptized and the minister, if now is really the important time to make that happen. And are they willing to be in each other's circle? And how large are those circles? I think a minister needs to be very careful that, because their circle can become very, very large very, very quickly of people that they're in regular contact with. And that may be true for the person being baptized as well. Do you want to add one more person into your circle of people that you're in contact with? And of course, there's all the mitigating factors you could pursue in order to just make sure that you're very protected during that process, the baptismal experience itself. But I think the main question is this the right time? Or is it okay to wait, another few weeks or a month or two? I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes here, but I've felt bad for folks who had weddings scheduled during this time, and for many of them, they've either had to very much adjust the experience to an incredibly private, family-only kind of scenario, or cancel it altogether, or not cancel it so much as delay it. And that may be painful in the short term, especially if a lot of investment has gone into that. I think a baptism is something that for many, and I'm sure we can find some rare circumstances where this wouldn't be the case, but I think for many it could be something delayed until things are a bit more reasonable.
Yeah, and I know that there have been situations where weddings, funerals have gone on, and there have been some mass infections that have happened as a result of those services, and some with very tragic results. So
unfortunately the case.
Yeah.
And I every morning I wake up and I'm waiting for the Adventist church to be all over the news, because we decided to do things our way and threw caution to the wind, and did not behave as a reasonable organization would under whatever circumstances, and that we caused people to become ill and potentially cause some deaths. That is not what we're about, and is inconsistent with what we're here to do. I try to keep things very much, every decision in my life and all that I see happen in the world, I try to keep it in the context of who was Christ and what was he trying to do. And I also am looking forward to seeing Christ in person. That said, I think who Christ is, and this has direct relevance to our scenario right now, he loves all people. And I think we should be encouraged to pray that the winds of strife are held back so that more people can be reached with the love of Christ. I know we all want to go home and go to a better place. I think what's on Christ's mind is, yeah, we'll get there, but could we reach one more soul right now? And caring for people's well-being in that way is what I think a disciple of Christ should be focused on at this time.
And how we act in this time can be a great example and point to him. You mentioned contact tracing, and just wanted to come back to that again. Are we required to do that? And if we are, or if we choose to do that, what other types of issues should we be concerned about? Is there privacy issues that come into play there? What should we be concerned about if we are participating in contact tracing?
Right, absolutely. I think that's a developing area. There may be some places where a church is required to provide documentation that would facilitate contact tracing, such as keeping a list of attendance. Everybody who attends has to sort of register. There are, my name, my wife's name, my daughter's name. And the guidance that I've seen on this, for those who are theorizing how that should work, churches would do well to, indicate where that person sat in the facility, and, kind of provide some like a grid-like approach to understanding how to say where everyone was for a given service, and then keep that information for at least, I think it's a 3-week period, and have a process whereby that information is destroyed. I don't think that is a requirement anywhere that I'm aware of yet. That doesn't mean it isn't. And I would be listening carefully to hear if that does become a requirement, because you're absolutely right. People's privacy is also a serious concern. If you have people's personal private information, you have a duty to protect that information. If you fail in that duty, you've caused a whole other problem for your organization that is significant. So do you have what it takes to keep that information private? I think it also raises issues with communicating that is what's taking place at your facility, and some folks are going to be reluctant to participate because of it. That's what you're up against, though. And so if your jurisdiction requires that to take place, then by all means follow their guidelines and engage in that, make that happen. And they should be providing, I've seen a lot of information on how to go about contact tracing. There's courses if you're going to become somebody who does that. To my knowledge, the burden has been on those individuals to engage in the research and investigation to figure it out. The burden of the church would simply be to have information available in order to facilitate the discovery of that information. If you didn't record who was ever at your church and where they sat, it would be hard to remember afterwards. So that's what that would facilitate. I look for further developments and guidance from government authorities on it.
Yeah.
And I apologize if that is the case somewhere already and I've missed it. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist somewhere, but there's no way that we can know everywhere yet.
Right. And then I think the final question, and again another new one for this session. What precautions can need to be taken? You talked about the alternative ways to collect tithe and offering rather than just passing the offering plate, but there is still then money and tithe envelopes that need to be sorted and counted by the Treasury staff. Have you seen guidance on how to properly protect those individuals in handling that? Is there certain PPE that's required? I'm assuming gloves would be part of that process. What do you know about that situation?
I know very little about that situation yet, although you've sort of pointed us in the right direction. I believe there is guidance available on that. I know some banks are encouraging the continued use of and deposit and use of paper money. So I believe that information is available. You've pointed us in the right direction, however, of if you're going to be interacting with that, and somebody needs to, if you collect it, it probably needs to go through a disinfection process. And if you're going to be handling it, you should be gloved, you should be face mask, and it may be possible to to disinfect the actual currency itself and checks and envelopes and all of that. Interesting process to have to figure out. We'll look for guidance for inclusion in our FAQ.
Yeah. Well, very good. Again, just so many great questions, and I know that this is a topic that that everybody is interested in, and it's because it touches all of us. And I think we are all on some level anxious to return to some level of normalcy, and church is a great place to find that fellowship and community. And so I know that that's why this is just such an important topic for everybody. And we will continue to bring resources to not only this subject, but any others that touch on COVID-19 and as they develop. And I think we have some slides that show some of those resources. We will make this presentation available later this evening on our website. And for those of you that have been noting the strange lines that have showed up on this presentation, I thank you for your patience with that. We will have a clean stream video that goes up later, so you won't have to deal with that on the recording. But please point any of your friends and colleagues to that website so that they can watch that. Again, that will be on our website, adventistrisk.org/COVID-19. And I think we actually have that on the next screen, but I want to point you to our solutions newsletter. We have been covering several topics related to the pandemic. There was some conversation, questions about the security of Zoom, and we have covered that topic. We have covered other areas of the pandemic as they occur, and we are continuing to do that. Like David said, with this frequently asked questions that will be out very soon. And we do have future webinars that we are planning on both security, and then also as we get closer to the end of the beginning of the school year, rather the end of the summer, we will talk about how to safely open schools. Some additional resources here for the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and then also the WHO if you are international. But again, that you see the website there where we have all of our resources listed. Anything that we have mentioned or pointed you to today will be available on that site, adventistrisk.org/COVID-19. And so with that, again, just want to say thank you to David for presenting today. Appreciated the insight that you brought and the information. And again, want to mention our friends at the North American Division for helping us to promote this and let all of you know that this was happening. And if for those of you that are watching on Facebook as well, thank you for streaming with us on Facebook Live. Glad to have you with us for this webinar as well. David, any final words, any final guidance or wisdom that you want to share with us today?
Well, you set the bar high there, but thank you, Chris. I think as I conclude, I hope that you have throughout this webinar gotten a sense that there are resources available for your questions and as you navigate this, and as a principle that you are following the guidelines and expectations in your area. Those are contextualized for the reality of where you're located, and I hope that you will be a great citizen wherever you are. The other thing is that this is a developing situation. The things that we said today, we may learn more about going forward, and you may learn more about going forward as well. Scientists are conducting a lot of research. There are a lot of experiences taking place as we test these measures in the real world. And so I hope that you'll take a practical approach. Look for further updates. Chris mentioned signing up for our solutions newsletter, as well as just stay in touch with your local government authority, wherever you're getting your guidelines where you are. I know I check my my state website on COVID-19 just about every day right after 10 o'clock, which is when they update it. I track it very, very carefully. And I'm reading information from around the world on this topic as well, because there's great information to be had. Lastly, I would just say thank you to everyone who is taking the time to be a leader through this process. And I want to encourage you. There are a lot of sad, tragic situations that have happened throughout this experience. And I understand that, I acknowledge that. My heart goes out to those who are in pain throughout this experience. There's those who have lost a loved one. There are those who just find this stay-at-home scenario extremely difficult and painful. But I am also aware of people's incredible resiliency and creativity. And I see opportunities for the church to respond and react in new and creative ways. Sometimes a bit of disruption goes a long way to growth in a positive way. I get excited about that. And I know that those who are on the webinar today are part of making their church congregations better, more effective, spreading the love and the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, are we discouraged by this scenario? Absolutely not. We were put, I think of the story of Esther. Maybe we're here for exactly this time. So I encourage you, and I ask you to take a positive approach to reaching out to your fellow men, be an example, lead your team, your congregation, your fellow church congregants forward through this difficult time. Maybe we won't just get through this. Maybe we'll get through this even better than we expect. So thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Appreciate it. And that concludes our program today. Thank you again so much for watching. And stay tuned for more great webinars and information from Adventist Risk Management. Thanks so much.